A billionaire's life shatters when he encounters a young girl at a charity event who is identical to his daughter who vanished 8 years ago. When he brings her home, his wife becomes hostile, and his closest advisor tries to keep them apart. As he digs deeper into the past, he uncovers a web of lies that will destroy everything he believed about his perfect life. What happens next is even more shocking. Leave a like to keep following our upcoming videos, and don't forget to subscribe to receive more incredible stories like this one. Richard Hamilton stood at the podium of St. Mary's Community Center in the Bronx, his perfectly tailored suit a stark contrast to the worn wooden stage beneath his feet. The annual Hamilton Foundation charity event was something he'd grown to dread over the past 8 years. Each time he saw a child in need, his mind wandered to Eleanor, and the wound would tear open again. "We're pleased to announce a $5 million grant to support local youth programs," he announced, his voice steady despite the familiar ache in his chest. The crowd applauded, but Richard barely heard them. His eyes had locked onto someone, in the back of the room. A small girl, no more than 10 years old, stood partially hidden behind a column. Her dark brown hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and even from this distance he could see her hazel eyes that mirrored Eleanor's perfectly. His hands gripped the podium tighter, knuckles turning white. Michael, his advisor of 15 years, noticed his distraction and smoothly took over the presentation. Richard stumbled off the stage, his legs carrying him toward the girl before his mind could process what he was doing. But as he approached, she disappeared into the crowd. The next hour was torture. Richard moved through the reception mechanically, shaking hands and nodding at appropriate intervals, but his eyes never stopped scanning the room. Just when he'd convinced himself he'd imagined her, he felt a tug on his sleeve. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was small, uncertain. "Could you help me find my mom?" Richard turned, and the world stopped spinning. Standing before him was not just a girl who resembled Eleanor. She was identical. The same nose, the same chin, even the small scar above her right eyebrow where Eleanor had fallen from her bike when she was 5. His chest tightened until he could barely breathe. "What's your name?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "Sophie," she replied, fidgeting with the hem of her worn sweater. "Sophie Mitchell. My mom was supposed to meet me here, but I can't find her." Richard's mind raced. Sophie Mitchell, not Eleanor Hamilton. But the resemblance was impossible to ignore. He knelt down to her level, noticing more details that made his heart pound. The way she tilted her head slightly when speaking, the small dimple in her left cheek. "Where do you live, Sophie?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm while his hands trembled. "The shelter on 183rd Street, she answered, her eyes downcast. "Mom lost her job 3 months ago." Michael appeared at Richard's side, his presence both familiar and suddenly suspicious. "Mr. Hamilton, the press is waiting for your statement about the grant." Richard ignored him, focused entirely on Sophie. "When did you last see your mother?" "This morning. She said she'd be here by 4. Sophie's voice wavered. "It's almost 6 now." Michael's hand gripped Richard's shoulder. "Sir, we really need to—" "Cancel everything," Richard cut him off. "Sophie, would you like to come with me while we look for your mother? We can make some calls, get something to eat." Michael's grip tightened. "Mr. Hamilton, I strongly advise against—" "I wasn't asking for advice, Michael." Richard's tone left no room for argument. He turned back to Sophie, whose eyes had brightened at the mention of food. "There's a diner around the corner. We can start there." As they walked out of the community center, Richard noticed Sophie had a slight limp, just like Eleanor had after her accident. His mind spun with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. But one thought kept repeating. Eleanor had disappeared without a trace 8 years ago, and now here was a girl who could be her twin, living just miles from his home. Michael followed them, speaking urgently into his phone. Richard caught fragments of the conversation. "Victoria needs to know. Yes, immediately. This could be a problem." The diner was nearly empty when they arrived. Sophie slid into a booth, and Richard sat across from her, unable to take his eyes off her face. She ordered a cheeseburger with extra pickles, Eleanor's favorite. "Sophie," Richard began carefully, "how long have you lived at the shelter?" "A few months. Before that we lived in Queens, but—" She stopped suddenly, her eyes widening as she looked past Richard's shoulder. A woman burst into the diner, her face pale with panic. "Sophie! Oh my God, Sophie!" She rushed to their table, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, baby. The bus broke down, and my phone died, and—" Richard stood slowly, studying the woman's face. She was thin, with graying brown hair and worn clothes, but her eyes, they were nothing like Eleanor's, nothing like Sophie's. "Thank you for watching her," the woman said, finally acknowledging Richard. "I'm Janet Mitchell, Sophie's mother." But as Janet spoke, Richard noticed something that made his blood run cold. Sophie's hand, still holding her burger, trembled slightly, and her eyes, when they met his, held something he recognized all too well. Fear. The same fear he'd seen in Eleanor's eyes the day before she vanished. The drive back to the Upper East Side felt endless. Richard's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as his mind replayed every detail of his encounter with Sophie. Michael sat in the passenger seat, breaking the tense silence with occasional glances at his phone. "Sir, perhaps we should discuss this before you mention it to Mrs. Hamilton," Michael suggested carefully. "The resemblance is striking, but you need to consider the implications of raising this subject with Victoria. She's only just started to recover." Richard's jaw tightened. "Recover? It's been 8 years, Michael. 8 years since our daughter vanished, and Victoria hasn't shed a single tear. Not one." The Mercedes pulled through the gates of their townhouse, and Richard noticed Victoria's silhouette in the second-floor window. She was already waiting. Michael had texted her. Of course he had. "Richard!" Victoria's voice was sharp as they entered the foyer. She stood at the top of the stairs, perfectly poised, in an expensive silk dress, her blonde hair immaculate even at this late hour. "Michael tells me you've had an interesting evening. We need to talk," Richard said, heading straight for his study. Victoria followed, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. The study door had barely closed when Victoria spoke again. "You're going to destroy everything we've built, aren't you? Over some coincidence?" "Coincidence?" Richard's voice rose. "She has Eleanor's scar, Victoria, the exact same scar, in the exact same place. She limps on the same leg. She even orders her food the same way. Do you hear yourself?" Victoria's laugh was brittle. "You're talking about a homeless child who probably researched our family. This wouldn't be the first time someone's tried to exploit Eleanor's disappearance." "She wasn't trying to exploit anything. She didn't even know who I was at first." Richard paced the room, running his hands through his hair. "And her mother. There was something off about that woman. The way Sophie looked when she arrived." Victoria's face hardened. "Stop. Just stop." She moved to the bar cart, pouring herself a generous measure of scotch. "We agreed after the last time that we wouldn't do this anymore. No more private investigators. No more false hopes. Eleanor is gone." "The last time?" Richard froze. "What last time, Victoria?" She took a long sip before answering. 3 years ago. That girl in Connecticut. You were convinced she was Eleanor too, remember? You nearly drove yourself mad until the DNA test proved otherwise." "What DNA test?" Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. "I never ordered any DNA test." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she set down her glass. "Michael handled it. He thought it would be better if you didn't have to deal with the details. Michael handled it." Richard's laugh was hollow. "Just like Michael handles everything, doesn't he? Our finances, our schedule, our staff." He stepped closer to his wife. "Tell me, Victoria, who really runs this household? Because lately, it feels like our trusted advisor has more control than either of us." "You're being paranoid," Victoria snapped. "Michael has been nothing but loyal. He's protected this family." "Protected us from what?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Victoria's face went blank, a practiced expression Richard had seen too many times before. "I'm tired," she said finally. "This conversation is over. You will not pursue this matter with that girl. You will not upset the balance we've finally achieved. Am I clear?" But Richard barely heard her. His eyes had caught something on her desk, a torn piece of paper, partially visible beneath a magazine. As Victoria turned to leave, he moved closer, reading the hastily scrawled words. "DNA match confirmed. 99% probability." The date on the paper was from 2 weeks ago. "Richard?" Victoria's voice had an edge of panic now. "What are you looking at?" He turned to face his wife, holding up the paper. "Would you like to explain this?" The color drained from Victoria's face. In the distance, a door opened and closed, Michael entering the house with his usual silent efficiency. Victoria's eyes darted to the study door, then back to Richard. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Richard's voice was deadly calm. "Because what I think is that you and Michael have been lying to me for years. What I think is that you know exactly who Sophie Mitchell really is." Before Victoria could respond, there was a knock at the door. Michael entered without waiting for an answer, his face grave. "Sir, there's been a development," he said. "Sophie Mitchell and her mother have disappeared from the shelter. No one knows where they've gone." Richard looked between his wife and his advisor, seeing the silent communication in their glances. The paper in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "What did you do?" he whispered, but he already knew the answer. He had seen it in Sophie's eyes at the diner. That flash of recognition, that moment of fear. She had known exactly who he was, and now she was gone. Again. The shelter on 183rd Street was a crumbling 5-story building with peeling paint and rusty fire escapes. Richard stood in what had been Sophie's room, a tiny space barely big enough for 2 narrow cots. The beds were stripped bare, but something caught his eye beneath one of them, a small notebook, forgotten in the hasty departure. "They left around midnight," the shelter manager explained, wringing her hands nervously. "Janet said they had relatives in Chicago who could take them in, but it was strange. There was a man in a suit who came first. After he left, that's when they packed up and disappeared." "A man in a suit?" Richard's voice was hoarse. "Did he have a silver tie pin? Square glasses?" The manager nodded slowly. "Yes. How did you know?" "Michael. Of course it was Michael." Richard flipped through the notebook, his hands shaking. Most pages were filled with childish drawings, but one caught his attention. A detailed sketch of a house. His house. The Hamilton Mansion. Drawn from memory, with every window and architectural detail perfectly placed, just as Eleanor used to draw it. His phone buzzed, Victoria calling for the 10th time since he'd stormed out last night. He ignored it, focusing instead on a small notation in the corner of the drawing. "Home. Maybe. Ask Clara." Clara. The name hit him like a physical blow. Clara had been their housekeeper when Eleanor disappeared, the only staff member who'd worked directly with the family. She'd quit abruptly 2 weeks after Eleanor vanished, leaving no forwarding address. "Sir?" A young volunteer approached hesitantly. "I found something else. Security footage from last night." She held up a tablet, showing grainy video of the shelter's entrance. Richard watched as Michael entered at 11:42 p.m., leaving 17 minutes later. At midnight exactly, Janet and Sophie hurried out with a single bag between them. But something was wrong with the image. "Can you zoom in?" Richard asked, his heart pounding. The volunteer complied, focusing on Sophie's face. In the enhanced footage, it was clear. Sophie was crying, and Janet's grip on her arm was tight enough to hurt. Richard's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Michael. "You need to stop this now. Think about Victoria. Think about Victoria." The words echoed in his mind as he drove to his office, the notebook burning a hole in his briefcase. Over the past 8 years, everything had been about Victoria, her grief, her recovery, her need for privacy. But now Richard wondered if he'd been blind to something darker. At his desk, he began digging through old files. Clara's employment record showed she'd worked for them for 15 years before Eleanor's disappearance. Her reference had come from... Richard sat up straight. Her reference had come from Michael, who'd known her from his previous position. A knock at his office door made him jump. His secretary, Sarah, entered with a concerned expression. "Mr. Hamilton, there's something you should see." She handed him a thick folder. "I was organizing old documents and found these in the archived files. They're medical records for Eleanor, but some of them don't make sense." Richard opened the folder with trembling hands. Birth certificate, vaccination records, school physicals, all normal, until he reached the DNA test results from Eleanor's first year. The blood type listed didn't match either his or Victoria's. "There's more," Sarah said quietly. "I found correspondence between Mr. Reed and a private adoption agency from 10 years ago. It's all in code, but Michael arranged an adoption." Richard's world tilted on its axis. "Without telling me?" "Not exactly." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "The documents suggest Mrs. Hamilton was the one who initiated it. Mr. Reed just facilitated everything." Richard's phone buzzed yet again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. The text contained only an address in Queens and 2 words: "Find Clara." He was halfway to his car when Victoria called again. This time, he answered. "Where are you?" she demanded. "Looking for our daughter," he replied coldly. "She's not our daughter, Richard. She never was." Victoria's voice cracked. "And if you don't stop digging, you're going to destroy everyone involved, including Eleanor." "What do you mean, including Eleanor?" "Victoria, is she alive?" But Victoria had already hung up. Richard's phone immediately lit up with another text from the unknown number. "Hurry, they're moving her again tonight." His hands shook as he started the car. The address in Queens was 40 minutes away in good traffic. As he pulled into traffic, he didn't notice the black SUV that pulled out behind him or the familiar silver tie pin glinting in the driver's side mirror. The address led Richard to a run-down apartment complex in Queens, its brick facade stained with decades of city grime. As he approached the building, the black SUV that had been following him crawled past, but Richard barely noticed. His attention was fixed on apartment 3B, where a light had just flicked on. He climbed the narrow stairs, the musty air growing thicker with each step. At 3B, he raised his hand to knock, but the door opened before his knuckles could touch the wood. "I've been expecting you." Clara hadn't aged well. Her once dark hair was now completely grey, and deep lines carved valleys around her mouth. But her eyes were as sharp as ever. "8 years too late, but you're finally here." The apartment was small but meticulously clean. Clara led him to a kitchen table covered in manila envelopes and old photographs. "Sit," she commanded. "We don't have much time." "Clara, I need to know about Sophie, about Eleanor, about your wife's secrets." Clara's laugh was bitter. "Which lie would you like me to unravel first, Mr. Hamilton?" Richard's hands clenched into fists on the table. "All of them." Clara nodded, pulling a photograph from one of the envelopes. It showed a much younger Victoria standing outside a hospital, her arms wrapped protectively around her midsection. The date stamp read 1990, 13 years before Eleanor was born. "Your wife never told you about her first child, did she?" Clara's voice was gentle now. "The one she gave up for adoption when she was 17? Richard stared at the photo, his mouth dry. "What?" "Victoria came from money, but not nearly enough to satisfy her. She married her first husband straight out of high school, Thomas Mitchell." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Mitchell, Sophie's supposed last name. "They had a daughter," Clara continued, "but Victoria was young, ambitious. A baby didn't fit into her plans, so she gave the child up, divorced Thomas, and reinvented herself. That's when she met you." "But Eleanor was that baby's daughter." Clara's words fell like stones. "Your wife's granddaughter?" Victoria tracked down her first daughter years later. She'd grown up, had a child of her own, Eleanor, but the daughter wanted nothing to do with Victoria. She threatened to expose Victoria's past, which would have ruined the carefully constructed image Victoria had built. Richard's world spun. So Victoria arranged to have Eleanor taken. She used Michael's connections to make it look like a kidnapping. The plan was to raise Eleanor as her own, keep her real mother quiet with threats and money. Clara's hands trembled as she laid out more photographs. I discovered the truth by accident. That's why I had to leave. They knew I knew. And Sophie is Eleanor. Victoria's been moving her between foster homes and shelters for 8 years, keeping her close enough to watch but far enough to control. The woman, claiming to be Janet Mitchell, is being paid to act as her mother. Richard felt bile rise in his throat. My God, we've been living in the same city all this time. She's been suffering in shelters while we... His voice broke. Victoria's obsession with maintaining her image, her status, it consumed her. Eleanor was just another piece of the perfect life she'd fabricated. Clara glanced nervously at the window. But now you've seen Eleanor, Sophie, and everything's falling apart. A loud bang from the hallway made them both jump. Clara's face went pale. They're here. Michael must have followed you. We have to get out. No! Clara thrust a key into his hand. Storage Unit 247 at Access Storage on Vernon Boulevard. Everything's there. Proof, documents, recordings. Get Eleanor's real mother's information. Find her. She can help. She shoved him toward a fire escape. Go! Now! The apartment door burst open as Richard climbed out the window. He heard Michael's voice, then Clara's defiant response cut short by a sharp sound. He forced himself to keep moving, even as his hands shook so badly he could barely grip the metal rungs. In the alley below, he nearly collided with a small figure lurking in the shadows. His heart stopped as Sophie, Eleanor, looked up at him with terrified eyes. They're going to move me again, she whispered. Please don't let them. Before Richard could respond, headlights flooded the alley. The black SUV had returned. Eleanor grabbed his hand, her grip desperate and familiar. Run, she said. And they did, just as they heard Clara's scream echo from 3 stories above. Richard and Eleanor ran through a maze of narrow alleys, their footsteps echoing off brick walls. The black SUV pursued them relentlessly, forcing them to zigzag between buildings. Eleanor's small hand clutched his tightly, her breathing ragged but determined. This way, she whispered, pulling him toward a chain-link fence. There's a hole behind the dumpster. I used it before, when they tried to move me last time. Richard's heart clenched at her words. How many times had she been forced to run? How many times had she hidden in these filthy alleys while living just miles from her real home? They squeezed through the gap and emerged onto a busy street. Richard flagged down a taxi, keeping Eleanor close as they slid into the back seat. Vernon Boulevard, he directed, his voice shaking. Access storage. Eleanor looked up at him with wide eyes. You know about the storage unit? Clara told me right before... He couldn't finish the sentence. The sound of Clara's scream still echoed in his ears. Clara was nice to me, Eleanor whispered. She would visit sometimes, bring me books and food when that woman was drinking. She told me who I really was, but said I had to pretend not to know, that it wasn't safe yet. Richard pulled her closer, his throat tight with rage and grief. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I should have found you sooner. I should have known something was wrong. They were very careful, she said, sounding far older than her 10 years. Victoria made sure I never stayed in one place too long. And Michael, he would check on me, make sure I wasn't telling anyone anything. The taxi driver glanced at them in the rearview mirror, concern evident on his face. Richard realized how they must look, a disheveled man in an expensive suit and a small girl in worn clothes, both clearly frightened. My daughter, he explained, meeting the driver's eyes. I'm taking her home. The driver nodded slowly, then deliberately turned off his meter's tracking system. No record of this ride, sir, just in case. They reached Access Storage 15 minutes later. The facility was closed, but Eleanor led them to a side entrance. The guard here, he lets me sleep inside sometimes when it's cold. He'll help us. Sure enough, an elderly security guard opened the door at Eleanor's knock. His eyes widened at the sight of Richard. "This your father, little one. The real one." Eleanor nodded. The guard ushered them inside quickly, locking the door behind them. "Unit 247, right? Better hurry. Some men were asking about it earlier today." They rushed through the maze of storage units. At 247, Richard's hands trembled as he inserted Clara's key. The door rolled up to reveal a small space packed with filing cabinets and boxes. "She kept everything," Eleanor breathed, moving to a cabinet marked EH. Inside were photos, school records, medical files, 8 years of a stolen life, meticulously documented. Richard found a thick folder labeled Origins. Inside was a birth certificate, Eleanor's real one, showing her mother's name, Catherine Mitchell. With it was a recent photo of a woman in her 30s who looked startlingly like an older version of Eleanor. "That's my real mom," Eleanor's voice cracked. "Victoria's daughter?" "Yes," Richard continued reading. "She lives in Boston now. She's been looking for you, Eleanor, all these years. She's never stopped." A newspaper clipping fell from the folder. The headline made Richard's blood run cold. "Local teacher still searching for missing daughter. Threatens legal action against wealthy family." The article detailed Catherine's accusations against the Hamiltons, claiming they had orchestrated her daughter's disappearance. But the story had been buried, never making it past local news. Another document showed why, a series of large payments from offshore accounts to various media outlets. "Michael's handwriting," Richard noted grimly, recognizing the notations in the margins. Eleanor was examining another box, her face pale. "There's more," she said, pulling out a DVD. The label read simply, "Insurance." Before they could investigate further, their phones buzzed simultaneously. Richard showed a message from Victoria. "Stop this now. You don't know what you're risking." Eleanor's message was from an unknown number. "Got your mother. Come alone to the old house on 82nd, or she dies this time." Richard stared at Eleanor's phone in horror. "Catherine. They must have taken her when they realized I was getting close." Eleanor's hands shook as she clutched the phone. "We have to help her. She's the only one who's ever really fought for me." A sound from outside made them both freeze. Car doors slamming, footsteps approaching. The guard's voice drifted down the corridor, stressed but firm. "Sorry, sir. We're closed." "No access without a warrant," Michael's voice replied, smooth as silk. "I think we can come to an arrangement." Richard grabbed the most crucial documents and shoved them into his jacket. Eleanor quickly pocketed the DVD. They looked around desperately for another exit, but there was only one way out, and Michael was getting closer. The storage unit felt like a trap closing in around them. Richard could hear Michael's footsteps getting closer, accompanied by at least 2 other sets. Eleanor tugged at his sleeve, pointing upward. Above them was a ventilation duct, its grate loose from age. "I can fit," she whispered. "I've done it before in other buildings when they were moving me." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Each casual reference to her years of abuse and survival carved new wounds in his heart. He interlaced his fingers to make a step for her, lifting her toward the duct. "No," Eleanor protested. "You have to come too." "I'll only slow you down. Take the documents, find help." He pressed the folder into her hands. "I'll keep them busy." Tears filled her eyes. "They'll hurt you. They've been hurting you for 8 years. That ends tonight." He lifted her higher. "Find Detective Sarah Chen at the 15th Precinct. She helped me before, when you first disappeared. Show her everything." Eleanor hesitated for one more moment before crawling into the duct. Richard replaced the grate just as Michael's voice echoed from around the corner. "It's over, Richard. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Richard stepped out of the unit, closing it behind him. Michael stood at the end of the corridor with 2 men he didn't recognize. All 3 wore dark suits and emotionless expressions. "Where's Eleanor?" Michael asked. "Safe from you," Richard spat. "It's all over, Michael. I know everything. about Victoria's first marriage, about Catherine, about what you both did to Eleanor. Michael's face remained impassive. And what exactly do you plan to do with this information? Go to the police, the media. Think carefully about who would believe the ravings of a grieving father over the word of his respected wife and trusted advisor. I have proof. Clara kept records. Clara is no longer a concern. Michael's words sent a chill down Richard's spine. And Catherine won't be either if you continue down this path. Richard's phone buzzed. A photo appeared. Catherine Mitchell, tied to a chair in what he recognized as the basement of their summer house on 82nd Street. Her face was bruised, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "You're going to kill her anyway," Richard said, the realization dawning. "Just like you planned to kill Eleanor if she ever remembered too much." "Victoria's reputation must be protected," Michael replied simply. "The scandal would destroy everything she's built. Everything you've built together." "I built nothing!" Richard's voice echoed off the metal walls. "My whole life with her has been a lie. She stole her own granddaughter, kept her in poverty and fear, all to maintain some twisted illusion of perfection." A small sound from above made Richard's heart stop, but he kept talking to cover it. "And you, Michael, what did she promise you? Money? Power? Or is there more to your loyalty?" Something flickered in Michael's eyes. "Victoria understands sacrifice, understands that sometimes terrible things must be done to protect what matters. And what matters to you, Michael? What could possibly justify 8 years of torturing an innocent child?" Michael stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You never wondered why Victoria chose me as her advisor, why she trusted me with everything, even before she met you." The pieces clicked into place. "You're her first husband's brother, Eleanor's uncle." "Very good." Michael's smile was cold. "Family helps family, Richard. Victoria and we've been protecting each other for a very long time." Above them, a metallic creak made the men look up. Richard seized the moment, charging forward. He caught Michael off guard, sending them both crashing into the storage unit door. The other men rushed forward, but Richard had already grabbed Michael's phone. "Eleanor!" he shouted. "The address! Run!" He managed to send the photo of Catherine to his own phone before a fist connected with his jaw. As he fell, he saw Eleanor's face in the duct, tears streaming down her cheeks. He mouthed one word: "Go." She disappeared as the men's boots began their work. Richard curled into a ball, protecting his vital organs as the kicks rained down. Through the pain, he felt almost peaceful. Eleanor was safe. She had the proof. It would all end soon. Then Michael's voice cut through the haze. "Enough. We need him conscious. Victoria wants to deal with this personally." They dragged Richard to his feet. His ribs screamed in protest, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But he smiled, because he could see through the small window at the end of the corridor, a tiny figure running across the parking lot, clutching a folder to her chest. "You won't find her," he mumbled through swollen lips. Michael grabbed his hair, yanking his head back. "We don't need to. She'll come to us. After all." His smile was terrifying in its gentleness. "She's just like her mother. She'll do anything to save someone she loves." The last thing Richard saw before consciousness faded was his phone lighting up with a final message from Victoria. Bring him home. It's time he understood exactly what family loyalty means. Eleanor ran until her lungs burned, clutching the precious documents to her chest. The streets of New York blurred past as she navigated the familiar shadows she'd learned to use as shelter over the years. Behind her, she could still hear the echoes of Richard's beating, see the blood on his face. But she couldn't go back. Not yet. He'd given her a mission. The 15th precinct loomed ahead, its stone facade illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. Eleanor hesitated in the shadows, remembering all the times Janet had warned her about police. Now she understood why. Victoria's web of lies wouldn't survive real investigation. Inside, the desk sergeant barely glanced at her. "Can I help you?" "Detective Sarah Chen." Eleanor said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Please, it's about Eleanor Hamilton. The name caused an immediate reaction. Within minutes, she sat in an interview room across from a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a kind face. I'm Detective Chen, she said softly. And you are? Eleanor placed the folders on the table. I'm Eleanor Hamilton, the real one, and Richard Hamilton is being tortured right now because he tried to save me. Sarah Chen's face went pale as she opened the files. Photos spilled out. Eleanor at various ages, documentation of her movements between shelters, financial records of payoffs. Then she reached the DVD. What's on this? She asked. I don't know. We found it right before they caught us. Eleanor's hands trembled. But they have my mother. My real mother, Catherine Mitchell. They're going to kill her if I don't go to the house on 82nd Street alone. Detective Chen studied the documents with growing horror. My God, she whispered. We investigated Catherine's claims 8 years ago, but there was never any proof. Victoria Hamilton's influence was too strong. Please, Eleanor begged, we have to help them, both of them. Sarah loaded the DVD into her laptop. The screen flickered to life, showing a teenage Victoria in a hospital room holding a baby, Catherine. But it wasn't a happy scene. Victoria was arguing with someone off camera. I won't let you ruin everything, young Victoria spat. The baby is gone, dead in childbirth. That's the story, and you'll stick to it if you know what's good for you. The camera shifted to show Michael, younger but unmistakable. Victoria, this is madness. Thomas will never believe. Thomas believes what I tell him to believe, just like Richard will years from now. Men are so easily managed when you know their weaknesses. Victoria's laugh was chilling. Keep the evidence if you must, brother dear. Your insurance against me. But remember, I have insurance against you too. The video jumped forward several years. Now it showed Victoria and Michael in an office, planning Eleanor's kidnapping in detail. Victoria's voice was cold as she outlined how they would break Catherine's spirit, using Eleanor as leverage to keep her silent about the past. Oh God, Eleanor whispered. There's more, isn't there? More than just me and my mother? Sarah Chen was already on her phone calling for backup. This goes deeper than anyone knew. Victoria Hamilton has been destroying lives for decades, and Michael Reed has helped her do it. She turned to Eleanor. But we need to be careful. If they see police approaching, they'll kill them both. Eleanor stood. That's why I have to go, alone, like they asked. Absolutely not. You don't understand. I've spent 8 years learning how they think, how they operate. I can get inside, find my mother and Richard. You can have teams ready, but I have to be the one to go in first. Sarah studied her face. You're very brave, Eleanor, and very smart. But you're also 10 years old. I stopped being a child the day they took me from my mother. Eleanor's voice was firm. Please, let me help save what's left of my family. After a long moment, Sarah nodded. Okay, but we do this my way, and you wear a wire. 20 minutes later, Eleanor stood before the old brownstone on 82nd Street. The wire itched against her skin, hidden beneath her worn sweater. Police teams were in position, invisible in the gathering dark, but she felt terrifyingly alone as she climbed the steps. The door opened before she could knock. Victoria stood there, elegant as ever in a black dress that seemed appropriate for either a cocktail party or a funeral. Hello, Eleanor, she said softly. Or should I say, granddaughter. Behind her, Eleanor could see Michael dragging a battered Richard toward the basement stairs. Their eyes met for one brief moment before he disappeared into the darkness below. Come in, dear. Victoria's smile was razor sharp. Let's have a long overdue family reunion. Eleanor crossed the threshold, her heart pounding. Somewhere in this house, her mother was waiting, and in the next few minutes she would either save her family or watch it destroy itself completely. The door closed behind her with a sound like a tomb being sealed. The house smelled of leather and expensive perfume. just as Eleanor remembered from glimpses through windows years ago. Victoria led her into a formal living room where crystal decanters caught the dim light. Everything was perfect, polished, a museum of artificial happiness. "Sit," Victoria commanded, gesturing to an antique sofa. "We have so much to discuss." Eleanor remained standing. "Where's my mother?" "Which one?" Victoria's smile was cold. "The woman who gave birth to you, or the one who gave birth to her? We're all family here, after all." From somewhere below came the muffled sound of impact, followed by a grunt of pain. Eleanor flinched but held her ground. "Why did you do it, all of it? Catherine was your daughter." "My mistake," Victoria corrected, "a teenage indiscretion that should have remained buried." But Catherine couldn't accept her role. She kept pushing, threatening to expose everything. She poured herself a drink with steady hands. "When she had you, I saw an opportunity. A chance to rewrite history. By stealing me, keeping me in poverty while you lived in luxury. By giving you the life you deserved, as my daughter, not my granddaughter. The Hamilton name, the fortune, the status, it should have been perfect." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "But you remembered too much. Even at 2, you kept asking for your real mother. We had to adjust the plan." Another cry of pain echoed from below. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "You're a monster. I'm a survivor." Victoria's eyes hardened. "Everything I've built, everything I am, came from understanding one simple truth. Power matters more than blood. Family is just another tool to be used." Is that what you told yourself when you watched me sleeping in shelters? When Michael's men dragged me from place to place in the middle of the night? You were safer than you knew. Protected, watched. We made sure you had enough to survive, but not enough to escape. The perfect balance. Eleanor felt sick. And Richard, did you ever love him, or was he just another tool? Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Richard was an unexpected complication. He actually believed in love, in family. His grief when we took you was so genuine. She laughed bitterly. "It almost made me regret choosing him." A door opened somewhere in the house. Michael's footsteps approached, then stopped in the doorway. Blood stained his usually immaculate shirt. "It's done," he said quietly. "Richard understands now, completely." Victoria nodded. "And Catherine, still alive for now." Eleanor's heart raced. The wire under her sweater suddenly felt hot against her skin. Where were the police? How long did they need? "What happens now?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Now," Victoria set down her glass. "Now we restore order. Richard will have a tragic accident, grief finally overwhelming him. Catherine will disappear, this time permanently. And you, my dear," her smile was almost gentle, "you'll have a choice." "What choice?" "Become who you were meant to be, my daughter, properly this time. We'll send you to boarding school abroad, give you a new name, a new start. In a few years, no one will remember Eleanor Hamilton or Sophie Mitchell." Victoria reached out to touch her face. "Or you can join your mother and Richard. Family helps family, or family destroys family. You decide." Eleanor let her grandmother's fingers brush her cheek. "You really believe you'll get away with this?" "We already have, for 8 years. Michael stepped closer. "The police never found a trace of you. The media buried the story. Money and power solve all problems, child." "Not all problems," Eleanor whispered. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean Clara kept records of everything. And right now, Detective Sarah Chen is reading all of them." The change in Victoria's expression was terrifying. Her elegant mask cracked, revealing something feral beneath. She grabbed Eleanor's arm hard enough to bruise. "You brought the police! You stupid, ungrateful!" She stopped, her free hand moving to Eleanor's sweater. "Of course!" A wire. Michael moved with frightening speed, but Eleanor was faster. Years of running, of hiding, had taught her well. She twisted free of Victoria's grasp and bolted for the door. "Get her!" Victoria's scream held no trace of sophistication now. "And kill the others! Now!" Eleanor ran through the dark house, hearing Michael's pursuit close behind. She had to reach the basement, had to warn them. A hand caught her hair, yanking her backward. She cried out in pain as Michael spun her around. "You're just like your mother," he snarled, "and never knowing when to give up." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "You're right. I am like my mother." Then she brought her knee up hard, just as Catherine had taught her during one of their secret meetings years ago. As Michael doubled over, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, police sirens growing closer. But she knew they might not be close enough, because Victoria was already moving toward the basement door, and the small pistol in her hand gleamed like black ice in the darkness. Eleanor charged down the basement stairs, her heart pounding against her ribs. Victoria was only steps ahead of her, the gun steady in her hand. The basement lights cast harsh shadows across faces she'd dreamed of for 8 years. Richard slumped against a support beam, blood trickling from his temple, and Catherine bound to a chair, her eyes fierce despite her bruises. "Mom," Eleanor whispered. Catherine's head snapped up at her voice. "Eleanor, run!" But Eleanor stood her ground. Above them, the sounds of police entering the house echoed through the floorboards. Victoria spun around, keeping the gun trained on Catherine while facing Eleanor. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. Her perfect hair had come undone, making her look almost feral. All these years of planning, of building the perfect life, destroyed by a child who can't understand what I've sacrificed. "I understand perfectly," Eleanor said, taking a careful step forward. "You sacrificed your own daughter's happiness for your image. Then you sacrificed your granddaughter's childhood for your lies. And now you're going to sacrifice 2 more lives because you can't admit what you really are." Victoria's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "And what am I, dear grandchild? A fraud, a coward, someone so afraid of losing control that she'd rather kill her own family than face the truth." Richard stirred, trying to push himself up. "Eleanor, don't." "Stay down," Victoria snapped, swinging the gun toward him. "You've been enough trouble already." Heavy footsteps thundered overhead. Michael's voice carried down the stairs. "Police! They're breaching the perimeter!" Victoria's composure cracked further. "It doesn't matter. None of it matters. Once you're all gone, it'll be my word against a few pieces of paper. Money fixes everything in the end." "Not everything," Catherine spoke up, her voice strong despite her split lip. "You couldn't fix me, Mother. Couldn't make me stay quiet about what you did. It couldn't stop me from loving my daughter, even from a distance." "Shut up!" Victoria's hand trembled slightly. "You were weak, just like your father. He never understood what it took to rise above our station, to become something more than ordinary." Eleanor took another step. "Is that why you killed him?" The basement went silent, except for the distant sound of police searching the house above. Victoria's face drained of color. "What did you say?" "It's in Clara's records," Eleanor said quietly. "The insurance papers. The convenient car accident after he threatened to expose what you'd done to Catherine, your own husband, and you killed him to keep your secret." "You don't know anything," Victoria whispered, but her mask was crumbling. "You're just a child." "I know everything. Clara made sure of it. Every detail, every crime, every person you've destroyed. It's all coming out now." Victoria's finger tightened on the trigger. "Then I have nothing left to lose." Several things happened at once. The basement door burst open as police finally found them. Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, his own gun drawn. And Catherine, who had been quietly working at her bonds, broke free with a cry of triumph. Victoria fired. Eleanor didn't think. She just moved, throwing herself toward her mother as the gun roared. Pain exploded in her shoulder as she crashed into Catherine, sending them both sprawling. Above them, more shots rang out. She heard Michael cry out, heard Victoria scream in rage and frustration. Then Richard's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't move! Any of you!" Eleanor looked up through a haze of pain to see Richard standing, holding Michael's dropped gun. Despite his injuries, his hands were rock steady as he kept the weapon trained on Victoria. "It's over," he said quietly. "All of it." Victoria stared at him, then at the gun, then at Eleanor bleeding in Catherine's arms. For a moment, something almost human flickered across her face. "I only wanted what was best," she whispered. "What I never had. Is that so wrong?" "You had everything," Catherine said, pressing her hand against Eleanor's wound. "A daughter who loved you, a husband who adored you, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough." Police officers swarmed down the stairs, but Victoria didn't seem to notice as they handcuffed her. She kept her eyes fixed on Eleanor. "You look just like Catherine at your age," she said softly. I thought if I could just start over, do it right this time." Then she was gone, led away with Michael into the night. Paramedics rushed in, surrounding Eleanor with urgent voices and gentle hands. Through it all, she held on to Catherine's hand, finally feeling her mother's touch after 8 long years. "Stay with me, baby," Catherine whispered. "Please stay with me." Eleanor tried to respond, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was Richard kneeling beside them, his face streaked with blood and tears. "Hold on, Eleanor," he begged. "We've only just found you. Hold on." Then everything faded to black. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the quiet room as Eleanor slowly opened her eyes. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming her face. Her shoulder throbbed dully, but the pain felt distant, manageable. As her vision cleared, she saw Catherine asleep in a chair beside her bed, their hands still intertwined. "Mom!" Her voice was barely a whisper, but Catherine's eyes flew open immediately. "Eleanor!" Tears streamed down her face as she carefully gathered her daughter into her arms. "Oh, baby, I was so scared." "How long?" "3 days," said a familiar voice from the doorway. Richard stood there, his own injuries bandaged but healing. "You lost a lot of blood, but the doctors say you're going to be fine." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the guilt and love warring in his expression. "It wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "None of it was." He moved to her other side, taking her free hand. "I should have known, should have looked harder when you disappeared, should have questioned Victoria's story." "Victoria fooled everyone," Catherine said quietly. "For decades, she was very good at what she did." "What's going to happen to her?" Eleanor asked. Richard's expression hardened. "She and Michael are facing multiple charges: kidnapping, assault, fraud, and now murder charges for Clara and Thomas Mitchell's deaths. The evidence Clara collected, combined with their actions that night, they'll never see freedom again." Eleanor absorbed this, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Victoria had been a monster, but she was still family, however twisted that connection had become. "And what happens to me now?" she asked in a small voice. Catherine squeezed her hand. "You come home with me, baby? To Boston? If that's what you want." "But what about—" Eleanor looked at Richard, who gave her a sad smile. "I'm not your legal father, Eleanor. I never was. But," he swallowed hard, "I'd like to be part of your life if you'll let me. Both of your lives." Catherine met his eyes. "You tried to save her, risked everything to bring her back to me. You'll always have a place in our family." A knock at the door interrupted them. Detective Chen entered, carrying a familiar box of files. "Sorry to intrude," she said, "but there are some things you should know." She sat at the foot of Eleanor's bed. "We've been going through Clara's records, the extent of Victoria's crimes. It's staggering. There were others before Catherine, other lives she destroyed to maintain her social position." "But it's over now?" Eleanor asked. Sarah nodded. "Thanks to you. Your bravery, your quick thinking with the wire. You helped us unravel decades of corruption and lies." "I just wanted my mum back," Eleanor said simply. "And now you have me," Catherine promised. "Forever." The next few weeks passed in a blur of healing and change. Eleanor's shoulder mended, leaving only a small scar to match the one on her eyebrow. Catherine took a leave of absence from her teaching job to stay with her in New York during her recovery. Richard visited daily, bringing books and games, slowly building a new kind of relationship with both mother and daughter. The press tried to turn it into a scandal, but Sarah Chen managed to keep the worst of it away from Eleanor. The public knew only that Victoria Hamilton and Michael Reed had been arrested for serious crimes. The full story would wait until Eleanor was ready to tell it, if she ever chose to. On the day Eleanor was discharged, she stood in her hospital room looking out over the city. So much had changed since that night at the charity event. So much pain had been exposed, so many lies unraveled. But from the ashes of Victoria's perfect illusion, something real had grown. "Ready to go home?" Catherine asked from the doorway. Eleanor turned to see both her mother and Richard waiting for her. Her family, not the one Victoria had tried to force into existence, but the one that had formed naturally through love, sacrifice, and truth. "Almost," she said. "Just one more thing." She walked to the window, took out the small key Clara had given her so long ago, and dropped it into the trash. She didn't need it anymore. All the locked doors in her life were finally open. "Now I'm ready." As they walked out together into the bright spring morning, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in 8 years. The shadows of the past would always be there, but they no longer had the power to darken her future. She had found her way home, not to a mansion built on lies, but to the simple truth of a mother's love and the unexpected gift of a second father's devotion. Behind them, the hospital doors swung shut on the last chapter of Victoria's twisted fairy tale. Ahead lay something far more precious: reality, with all its imperfect beauty. Eleanor squeezed both their hands as they walked into the sunlight together. Sometimes she had learned the happy ending isn't about having everything perfect. Sometimes it's simply about being free to live your own story.